Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. It was a mistake. That's the first thing I thought when I walked into the old library that afternoon. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air felt wrong. Thick, heavy, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Dust motes floated in the stale light filtering through dirty windows, and the musty scent of old paper was suffocating. I should have turned around right then, but curiosity got the better of me. That curiosity was the second mistake. I was drawn to the place by nothing more than a rumor, a whisper in the town about an abandoned library, closed for decades. No one seemed to know why it had been shut down, but the few who spoke of it did so in hushed tones, with a strange look in their eyes. Some said it was haunted, others said people went in and never came out the same. I didn't believe in ghost stories then, but that was before the books started whispering. The librarian's desk was just ahead, buried under a mountain of papers and forgotten books. A fine layer of dust covered everything, and yet there was an eerie sense of organization, like someone, or something, was still here, keeping track of it all. I scanned the shelves, the towering stacks of books stretching endlessly toward the high ceiling. They seemed to lean in on me, their spines cracked and worn, but intact. Too intact. I started to explore, cautiously at first. The shelves groaned as I ran my fingers along the spines of ancient, forgotten tomes. The air felt colder the deeper I went. There were no modern books here. Everything looked like it had been untouched for at least a century. I couldn't help but wonder why the place had been abandoned. The town was small, but people still needed a library, didn't they? This one seemed frozen in time, like the world had simply forgotten it. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the softest rustle, like paper shifting in the breeze. But there was no breeze. The windows were sealed, the air inside stagnant. I froze, listening, my pulse quickening in my chest. The sound came again, a gentle whisper, faint but unmistakable. It was as though the books themselves were speaking to each other in voices too quiet to be understood. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings creak, air moves in strange ways, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I ventured deeper into the maze of shelves, the whispers grew louder. They weren't words, not yet, but they were deliberate, intentional. They surrounded me, moving from one aisle to the next, always just out of reach. I found myself in a far corner of the library, where the shelves seemed older, the books more decayed. The titles on the spines were unreadable, the letters faded or scratched off completely. A single light bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows that twisted and danced with every flash of light. That's when I saw it. There was a book, larger than the others, sitting alone on a pedestal. Unlike the others, this one was pristine. The black leather cover gleamed under the faint light, and there was no dust on it, no sign of age or wear. It was as though someone had placed it there, waiting for me. Against my better judgment, I approached it. My fingers hesitated over the cover, and for a moment, I could have sworn the whispers stopped, as if holding their breath. I opened the book. The pages were blank, every single one of them, white and untouched. I flipped through in confusion, expecting to see some sort of text, some reason for the book's prominence. But there was nothing. I was about to close it when I saw something shift at the corner of my eye. A shadow. It moved fast, darting between the shelves, too quick for me to fully catch. My heart pounded. Hello? My voice echoed, the sound swallowed by the overwhelming silence that followed. No answer. I backed away, my eyes scanning the rows of books. The whispers returned, louder now, almost frantic. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words. Broken sentences, half-formed thoughts. I couldn't make them out clearly, but I knew they were directed at me, urging, beckoning. The light above me flickered again, and in that brief darkness I felt it. Something cold, watching me from the shadows. When the light returned, I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away from whatever was lurking in that corner. The shelves seemed to stretch out endlessly before me, no exit in sight. I could hear the books now, their voices rising, calling me back, warning me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned down another aisle, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. And then I saw it, another shadow, larger this time, standing at the end of the row. It didn't move. It just watched, its form shifting, growing darker. I stumbled backward, my hand grazing the spine of a book. Instantly, the whispering stopped. I pulled the book off the shelf without thinking, hoping it would offer some explanation, some way out. But as soon as I opened it, the room plunged into darkness. The light bulbs shattered overhead with a deafening crack, and I was left standing in the pitch black, the book in my hands. The whispers returned, louder than ever, surrounding me on all sides. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were screams, angry, desperate. I dropped the book, my hands trembling, and backed into a shelf. The wood creaked, and I could feel the books pressing in around me, their voices growing louder, filling my head with their cries. I ran. I don't know how I found my way back, but I did. I burst through the doors of the library and into the cold evening air, gasping for breath. The whispers faded the moment I crossed the threshold, but their presence lingered in my mind. I never went back to that library. I don't know what's inside those books or what it wanted from me, but sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear the faintest whisper. It's soft, almost imperceptible, like the sound of a page turning in the dark. And I know deep down that the books are still waiting for me, waiting for someone else to open them, waiting for their voices to be heard. I don't know why I agreed to that interview. It felt like an invasion of everything I'd tried so hard to forget. Yet here I was, recounting the events I'd spent years trying to bury. They had promised anonymity, but nothing about sharing what happened to me felt safe. The paranormal is real. Too real. I didn't need validation. I didn't need to hear other people's stories. I already knew the truth. The recorder clicked on, and the interviewer, her name was Megan, I think, looked at me expectantly. "Tell me what happened," she said softly. "In your own words. Take your time." My mouth went dry. The room felt smaller than it had moments ago. I shifted in my seat, wondering how to start. How do you explain a brush with death at the hands of something no one believes in? How do you convince someone that what you saw wasn't a hallucination or a nightmare, but something tangible? Something that still haunts your every waking thought? I took a breath, glanced out the window, and began. I was 27 at the time, living in a small town in the Pacific Northwest. It was one of those places that seemed perpetually overcast, where the trees loomed so tall and thick you couldn't see the sun half the year. I worked as a forest ranger back then, patrolling vast stretches of wilderness that hardly anyone visited. It was lonely work, but I liked it. Or I did, before the incident. There's a spot in the woods, about 10 miles out from the main trail, that locals call Dead Man's Bluff. It's a steep cliff overlooking the river, and legend has it that several people have died there over the years. Accidental falls mostly, but some say it's cursed. I didn't believe in curses, not until I went there myself. It was late October, just before the first snow, and I had been assigned to check the trail markers before winter set in. The air was crisp, the sky a heavy gray, and the forest was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on the frozen ground. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. Then I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the bluff. My first thought was that someone had gotten lost, maybe wandered too close to the edge. I called out, but there was no response. The voice came again, a woman's voice, and this time it was clearer. "Help," she whispered. "Please help me." Instinct took over. I ran toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the bluff, the voice grew louder, more urgent. "Help me, I'm here." I reached the edge and skidded to a stop, staring down into the jagged rocks below. There was no one there, no sign of anyone. I stood there, confused, scanning the area for any movement. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My skin prickled and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around slowly, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. Just the trees, tall and silent. Then I saw her. She was standing a few feet away, partially hidden in the shadow of a large pine. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted, and her skin pale as death. She looked wrong. Not just lost or injured, but wrong. Her eyes, empty, hollow, were locked on mine, and when she spoke, her mouth barely moved. "You have to help me." I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. "What happened?" She stepped closer, and I could see her more clearly now. The skin on her arms was mottled with dark bruises, her lips cracked and bleeding. But it was her eyes that terrified me. They were like black pits, endless, void of anything human. "You have to help me," she repeated. But this time, her voice was different, deeper, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She was inches from me now, her breath freezing in the air between us. "You're coming with me," she whispered. Then she reached out, her cold, bony hand grasping my wrist with impossible strength. The world tilted, and I felt myself being pulled forward toward the edge of the bluff. I dug my heels into the ground, tried to pull away, but it was like fighting against a current. The cliff loomed closer, the rocks below sharp and unforgiving. In that moment, I was sure I was going to die. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the grip loosened. The woman let go, her hollow eyes still fixed on mine. She took a step back, and for the first time, I saw the sadness etched into her face. "He'll come for you too," she whispered, and then she was gone. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know how long I sat there trembling, staring at the spot where she had stood. Eventually, I forced myself to get up, to walk back to the main trail. My legs felt like lead, and every step was a battle against the overwhelming urge to look behind me, to see if she was still there, watching. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, I was shaking so badly I could hardly speak. I told my supervisor what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off or accuse me of making it up. But he didn't. Instead, he went pale. "Dead man's bluff," he muttered, shaking his head. "I should have warned you. We don't send people out there alone anymore." I asked him why, my voice barely above a whisper. He told me about the others, about the hikers who had gone missing near the bluff over the years. Some of them were never found. The ones who were, well, they didn't come back the same. They spoke of a woman, pale and bruised, who lured them to the edge of the cliff, just as she had tried to lure me. "Most of them didn't survive the fall," he said, his voice hollow. "You're lucky." Megan paused the recorder. Her eyes were wide, her hands trembling slightly as she set her notepad down. I've heard stories like that before," she said quietly. "Not just from you. People all over the country have had similar experiences, brushes with the paranormal that nearly killed them. Some survived like you. Others weren't so lucky." I nodded, still shaken from the memory. "It's real," I said. "I don't care what anyone says. It's real." Megan looked thoughtful for a moment, then leaned forward. "Would you be willing to hear other stories? From survivors like you?" My first instinct was to say no. I didn't want to hear about other people's nightmares. I had enough of my own. But something in her expression told me she wasn't asking just out of journalistic curiosity. She needed to hear these stories as much as I did. Reluctantly, I nodded. She clicked the recorder back on and began to read from her notes. The first story was about a man in Louisiana who had been attacked by a shadow figure in his own home. He described it as a living darkness that pressed down on him in the middle of the night, suffocating him. He barely survived the encounter, waking up with deep bruises around his throat. Another story came from a woman in Scotland who claimed to have been dragged into a freezing lake by an unseen force while camping near Loch Ness. She had nearly drowned before being pulled out by her friends, but they all swore they hadn't seen anyone or anything else in the water with her. Story after story, each one more terrifying than the last. They all had one thing in common. They involved something paranormal, something malevolent, and each person had barely escaped with their life. By the time Megan finished, the room felt colder, and the shadows seemed longer, darker. My skin crawled, and I realized that the sensation of being watched, the one I had felt at Dead Man's Bluff, had returned. I stood up abruptly, my heart racing. I think that's enough for today. Megan looked up at me, her eyes wide. She seemed to understand. Of course, she said softly, turning off the recorder. Thank you for sharing. As I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was following me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the woman from the bluff, her empty eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing there. Still, I could feel it. A presence. A darkness that clung to me like a shadow. I don't know if I'll ever be free of it. Because once you've had a near-death encounter with the paranormal, it never really lets you go. The air smelled of salt and rotting seaweed as I stood on the deck, staring at the horizon. It was supposed to be an easy voyage, a short trip from the coast of Maine to Nova Scotia. But something felt wrong from the moment we set sail. The water was too calm, the sky too clear, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. I should have listened to my instincts, but I didn't. Now, as I write this, I'm not sure I'll ever make it back to land. It began on the second night at sea. The wind had died down completely, leaving our small fishing boat adrift in an eerie silence. There was no creak of the wooden hull, no whisper of the waves, just the oppressive quiet pressing in on us from all sides. I was alone on deck, the others asleep below, when I saw it. A faint light, barely visible, flickering on the horizon like a dying flame. At first I thought it was another ship, maybe a distant lighthouse. But the light seemed too erratic, too unstable. It danced on the water in a way that made my skin crawl, as if it wasn't really there, like a reflection of something long gone. I watched it for a while, unable to tear my eyes away. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a cold sweat forming on my brow. Something about that light filled me with a deep, unshakable dread, but I couldn't explain why. It was just a flicker after all, just a harmless light on the horizon. Then the wind picked up again, and the light vanished. I told myself it was nothing, probably a trick of the mind, and went back below deck. I didn't mention it to anyone the next morning, but the memory gnawed at me, unsettling in its simplicity. We pressed on. By the fourth day, the calm had given way to a growing unease among the crew. The weather had shifted, dark clouds gathering like ominous shadows over the water. It wasn't a storm, not yet, but it was close. And with each passing hour, I found myself drawn back to the deck, searching for that light on the horizon. I saw it again that night. The same flicker, closer this time, brighter. The others were below, drinking and laughing, oblivious to the strangeness creeping over us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I stayed on deck for hours, staring at the distant glow, until finally, One of the crew came up to check on me. "Jonas, you all right?" It was Pete, the ship's cook, a burly, good-natured guy who'd seen his share of strange things at sea. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I didn't want to admit that something out there had shaken me, had gotten under my skin. But Pete must have sensed it, because he glanced out over the water, squinting into the dark. "What is it?" he asked. I hesitated, then pointed. "There, you see that?" For a moment I thought I was going mad, that I'd been imagining it all along, but then Pete stiffened. His face drained of color as he took a step back. No way." "What?" I grabbed his arm. "What do you see?" He shook his head, muttering under his breath. "I've heard stories, but I didn't think..." "Think what?" I demanded. Pete turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the Cassandra." "The Cassandra?" I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Pete swallowed hard. "It's a shipwreck. Sank off this coast more than 100 years ago. But every so often, some say they've seen it. The phantom wreck, reappearing in the same place where it went down." I laughed, but it sounded hollow. "You're saying we're looking at a ghost ship?" "I'm saying we should turn back," Pete replied, his voice tight with fear. "Now." The light vanished again, but the unease remained, crawling under my skin like cold fingers. I didn't sleep that night, nor did Pete. He tried to convince the captain to change course, but the old man just laughed, brushing it off as superstition. We were fishermen after all, hardened by the sea. Ghost stories weren't going to scare us off. But as the days passed, things got worse. The weather took a turn for the worse, violent winds battering the ship as we pushed on. And every night, the light appeared, closer, more distinct. It wasn't just a flicker anymore. It was the outline of a ship, barely visible in the mist, its rotting hull illuminated by an otherworldly glow. It was as if the wreck itself was calling to us, drawing us closer, pulling us into its cold, dead embrace. By the 7th night we were lost. The compass spun uselessly, the charts made no sense. We were adrift, trapped in a swirling fog that pressed in on all sides. The crew was on edge, snapping at each other, fraying at the seams. Even the captain, usually so steady, had started to crack. And always, just beyond the veil of mist, that damned ship loomed, growing clearer with each passing hour. On the 8th night, it happened. We were in the galley, trying to ignore the groaning of the ship as it struggled against the waves, when we heard the sound. A faint, distant wail, like the cry of something long forgotten. It echoed through the hull, growing louder, more insistent. The crew froze, exchanging nervous glances. "What the hell is that?" one of them whispered. The wail grew louder, now a full-blown scream, as if the sea itself was in agony. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding, and raced up to the deck. What I saw froze me in place. The Cassandra was there, clearer than ever before. It was massive, its broken masts jutting out at odd angles, its hull blackened and decayed. But what chilled me to the bone were the figures on the deck. Pale, gaunt shapes, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in eternal screams. They weren't alive. They couldn't be. But they were there, moving, reaching out as if beckoning us to join them. The ship had appeared out of nowhere, so close I could have thrown a rope and latched onto it. It shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't possible. Behind me, Pete screamed, "We need to turn around. We need to..." But it was too late. The Cassandra surged forward, as if propelled by some unseen force, slamming into our boat with a sickening crunch. The impact threw us all to the deck, and for a moment, everything was chaos. Wood splintered, water poured in, and the eerie wails filled the air. We were sinking. I don't remember much after that. Just fragments. The cold rush of water, the screams of the crew, the twisted wreck of the Cassandra looming above us, its ghostly figures reaching down with skeletal hands. Somehow I survived, I don't know how. I woke up on a piece of driftwood, the wreck of our boat nowhere in sight. I was alone, miles from shore, with nothing but the endless sea stretching in every direction. The Cassandra was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I know one thing for certain. That ship, that phantom wreck, is still out there, waiting. The sound came at night. At first I thought it was the wind howling through the dense trees, but this was different. It had a sharpness, a resonance that made my skin crawl. I'd spent countless nights in the wilderness, hunting, hiking, and camping, but I'd never heard anything like it before. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, the deep, unsettling quiet of the forest. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. My name is Jack Harlow, and I was 31 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip into the northern Cascades. I'd heard whispers about that stretch of forest before, rumors from locals about strange happenings, odd sounds that couldn't be explained, but I wasn't superstitious. I figured it was just the usual campfire stories, tales meant to scare city folk. I grew up in the mountains, spent my life navigating remote places, and nothing out there had ever frightened me. But this trip was different. The silence had a weight to it, like something was lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, the sun already starting its slow descent behind the jagged peaks. The air was crisp, the sky a deep, cloudless blue. It was the kind of evening that made you feel alive, invigorated. I'd planned to hike for a few days, set up camp deep in the wilderness, far from the beaten path. I wanted to disconnect from the world, just me and the wild, no distractions. That's what I thought I needed. But now, as I stood alone, listening to that eerie wail echo through the trees, I wasn't so sure. It started on the second night. I'd set up camp near a small, crystal-clear stream, the sound of rushing water soothing as I cooked dinner over the fire. The first couple of days had been perfect, peaceful even. I hadn't seen a soul since I'd left the trailhead, and that was how I liked it. No signs of other hikers, no footprints, no disturbances. It was just me and the wilderness. That night, after I'd finished eating and doused the fire, I lay in my tent, staring up at the stars through the thin fabric. It was one of those moments where the quiet felt complete. No animals rustling in the underbrush, no wind, nothing but the faint trickle of the stream. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it. A scream. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It sounded muffled, as if it were coming from deep within the forest, but it was unmistakable. A long, high-pitched wail, like someone, or something, was in pain. I sat up immediately, heart pounding. I'd heard wild animals before, coyotes yipping, the occasional mountain lion growl in the distance, even owls that could make some pretty unsettling noises. But this was different. This was distinctly human. My first thought was that someone was out there, hurt, maybe lost. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped my tent, and stepped out into the cold night air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice carrying through the trees. Nothing. The scream had stopped as abruptly as it had begun, and the forest had fallen silent once more. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the tree line, my breath visible in the cool air. But there was no movement, no sign of anyone. For a moment I stood there, listening, waiting for any sign of life. But there was nothing. Just the dark, impenetrable wall of trees surrounding me. I stood there for a few more minutes, debating whether I should investigate further. But the scream hadn't repeated, and without any real direction, wandering into the woods at night didn't seem like the best idea. So, I went back to my tent, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe even a trick of the wind, but I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I packed up camp and continued my hike, pushing deeper into the forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest had a strange stillness to it. The usual sounds of wildlife, birds, insects, small animals scurrying through the underbrush, were absent. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath. By the third day, the isolation that I had craved began to feel oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, their thick branches blocking out the sky, casting everything in a dim, greenish light. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. I tried to ignore it, but as the day wore on, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. That night, the scream returned. This time, it was closer. I was sitting by the fire, trying to enjoy a cup of coffee, when the sound pierced the air again. A long, guttural wail, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was as if someone was out there, just beyond the light of the fire, in unimaginable pain. I shot up, dropping my mug, and grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the darkness. "Is anyone out there?" I yelled, my voice shaking. The scream stopped again, but this time I heard something else. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I swept the flashlight beam frantically but saw nothing. I was alone. Or so I thought. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat up by the fire, clutching my flashlight, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But the footsteps never came closer, and the scream didn't return. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up my gear and decided to head back to civilization. The hike had been a mistake. Whatever was out here, I didn't want to find out. As I retraced my steps, the forest seemed even more oppressive than before. The air was thick, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, certain that something was following me, just out of sight. I quickened my pace, eager to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. That evening, as the sun began to set, I found myself back at the clearing where I'd first heard the scream. I'd hoped to be farther along by now, but the terrain had slowed me down. I debated whether to camp here for the night or push on, but my exhaustion won out. I set up camp one last time, telling myself I'd leave at first light. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with strange noises again. But this time, it wasn't just one scream. It was many. The wailing echoed from every direction, closer than ever before, as if the forest itself was screaming. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight, but the light barely cut through the thickening mist that seemed to roll in from nowhere. The trees, once silent, groaned and creaked as though they were being pulled apart by invisible hands. Then, I saw it. Just for a second. A figure, pale and gaunt, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was watching me, its eyes black, hollow pits, its mouth open in a silent scream. I froze, unable to move, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around it seemed to vibrate with the force of the screams filling the forest. I blinked, and it was gone. I stumbled back to the fire, my hands shaking. The screams had grown louder, more frantic, and the mist had thickened, swirling around the camp like a living thing. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the fire sputtered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight, but it flickered and went out, leaving me in the thick, oppressive blackness of the forest. The screams were deafening now, a cacophony of voices all around me. I couldn't tell if they were human or something else entirely. Panic set in. I grabbed my pack and bolted into the forest, running blindly through the trees. Branches whipped at my face, roots tripped me up, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, the screams followed, closing in on me from all sides. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that endless screaming forest. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they would explode, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare stop. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath. The screams had stopped. The silence was overwhelming, crushing. I looked around, disoriented, trying to get my bearings, and then I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing at the edge of the clearing, pale, hollow-eyed, their mouths open in those silent, haunting screams. They stood there, watching me, unmoving, like ghosts trapped in a nightmare. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. As I turned to run, a hand, ice-cold and skeletal, closed around my wrist. I screamed. When I woke up, I was back at the trailhead, lying on the ground in broad daylight. There was no sign of the forest, no sign of the figures, and no memory of how I'd gotten there. All I knew was that I was done with the wilderness, because some forests scream. They say there are ghosts in the woods behind my grandparents' house, whispers carried on the wind that rushes through the trees. I used to think it was just old superstition, something told to frighten children or keep people from wandering too far. But now, as I sit here trembling, listening to the faint tapping on the basement door beneath my feet, I know there's more to it than that. My name is Caleb, and I never believed in ghosts. At least, I didn't until last summer when I spent 3 long months helping my grandparents renovate their property, a crumbling farmhouse that had stood for nearly 200 years, tucked deep into the Appalachian foothills of southern Ohio. It was supposed to be an escape. I'd just graduated from college and couldn't stand the idea of sitting around doing nothing all summer. My grandparents offered me a deal, help them with the house, and I could stay rent-free. It sounded perfect at the time, a break from the world, no responsibilities, just hard work and quiet nights in the country. I had no idea that the house had a history, one far darker than anything I'd ever imagined. I arrived at the house on a muggy June afternoon. The air was thick with humidity, and a storm threatened to break at any moment. The old farmhouse loomed in front of me, its white paint peeling, windows cracked, and the roof sagging in places. Still, there was something charming about it, a sense of history in every weathered board. My grandparents greeted me warmly, and we spent the first few days setting up my room and going over the renovation plans. It wasn't until the third night that I heard the first strange sound. I was lying in bed, listening to the cicadas buzzing outside my window, when I heard what sounded like footsteps on the floorboards above me. It was odd because no one else was upstairs, but I brushed it off as the house settling. Old homes make noises, right? I convinced myself that it was nothing, and eventually, I fell asleep. The next day, my grandmother made a casual remark over breakfast. "Did you know this house was part of the Underground Railroad?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "There's a tunnel in the basement that leads to the woods. It was used to hide runaway slaves during the Civil War." I stopped mid-bite, my fork hovering over my plate. "You're kidding." "Nope," she replied with a shrug. "Your grandfather and I never go down there, though. It's been sealed up for years. Dangerous, you know, with all the rotting beams and debris. But it's fascinating, isn't it? The history." Fascinating wasn't the word I would have chosen. As I chewed my eggs, I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine. A hidden tunnel beneath the house, and footsteps in the night. It felt too coincidental, but again, I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. It wasn't until the second week that things began to escalate. I was working in the yard one afternoon, clearing some brush near the edge of the woods, when I found something odd. A stone marker, half buried beneath a tangle of weeds. At first, I thought it was just a large rock, but as I brushed the dirt away, I realized it was a grave marker. The name had worn away with time, but the date, 1846, was still faintly visible. Chills ran down my arms despite the heat of the day. I hadn't expected to stumble upon a grave in the middle of nowhere, and the thought that someone was buried just a few feet from where I stood made my stomach turn. I told my grandfather about it later, and he simply nodded. Lots of folks died trying to escape to freedom back then, he said. "Some didn't make it. Could be one of them." I couldn't help but think of the footsteps I'd heard, and now, the weight of the house's history pressed down on me. That night, the footsteps returned, only this time, they were louder. I lay in bed, heart pounding, as the sound of heavy boots creaked across the ceiling. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. The hallway was empty. The doors to the bedrooms were all closed. But the air was thick, and I could feel eyes on me, something unseen watching. I swept the beam of the flashlight around, and that's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, the attic door was ajar. I'd never been up there before. It was a storage space, mostly forgotten. But now the door was cracked open, and a cool draft seeped out. I stood frozen for a moment, debating whether to investigate. Against my better judgment, I approached slowly, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath my weight. As I reached for the doorknob, the air seemed to grow colder. My breath came in short gasps, and a deep, unnatural silence settled around me. With trembling fingers, I pulled the door open wider and aimed the flashlight inside. The attic was empty, but something wasn't right. The dust on the floor had been disturbed, as if someone or something had walked through. A trail of faint footprints led from the far corner of the room to the attic window, which was nailed shut. My skin prickled with fear, and I backed away, closing the door behind me as quickly as I could. I didn't sleep that night. The following morning, I decided to investigate the basement tunnel. I'd never been down there, and my grandparents had warned me that it wasn't safe. But I had to know if there was something more going on beneath the house. Maybe the footsteps were coming from the tunnel, an echo or some strange phenomenon. I found the old door at the back of the basement, hidden behind a stack of old boxes. It was made of heavy oak, weathered and cracked with age. Rusted metal hinges creaked as I forced it open, revealing a set of stone steps descending into darkness. The air was damp, and a foul odor wafted up from below, mold and decay. I hesitated, but something compelled me to continue. With my flashlight in hand, I started down the steps, the walls closing in on either side as I descended deeper into the earth. At the bottom, I found the tunnel. It was narrow, barely wide enough to walk through, and the ceiling was so low I had to hunch over. The dirt floor was uneven, and the wooden beams holding up the walls looked ready to collapse at any moment. As I moved forward, my heart pounded in my chest. The beam of my flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, shaking it to keep the light steady. That's when I heard it, a low moan echoing from somewhere ahead. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, a mournful wail that sent a wave of dread crashing over me. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone. I turned to leave, but my foot caught on something buried in the dirt. I stumbled, my flashlight falling from my hand and clattering to the ground. The beam went out, plunging the tunnel into total darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the light, but before I could find it, I felt something cold brush against my ankle. I jerked my foot away, scrambling to my feet and running blindly toward the stairs. The wailing grew louder, more desperate, and I could feel something chasing me, something unseen, something angry. I reached the stairs and bolted up them 2 at a time, slamming the basement door behind me. My chest heaved as I collapsed against the wall, heart racing. That was the last time I ever went down to the basement. The final straw came a week later. It was the middle of the night, and I was jolted awake by the sound of a voice. A woman's voice whispering my name. "Caleb, help me." I shot up in bed, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice came again, soft and pleading, echoing through the house. I threw on my clothes and ran downstairs, desperate to find the source, but the house was empty. My grandparents were fast asleep in their room, oblivious to the horror I was living through. I followed the voice to the front door, and there, standing on the porch, was a figure. a woman dressed in a tattered old gown, her eyes hollow and dark. She looked at me with such sorrow, and in that moment, I knew. She was one of them, one of the souls lost to the Underground Railroad, trapped here forever. I stepped back, heart hammering, and she disappeared into the night. I left the next day. I haven't spoken about what happened since, but I know this. Those woods, that house, are haunted by the past, by the souls who never made it to freedom, and they're still searching for peace. I never considered myself a superstitious person. Sure, I'd heard the ghost stories, the tales that my parents told me when I was a kid, and the urban legends shared in hushed voices at campfires. But they never really got to me, not until the night it happened. The night the phantom hand reached out of the darkness and grabbed me. It was a Tuesday in late November, just after Thanksgiving. My wife, Laura, and I had just moved into an old Victorian house in the outskirts of New England. It was the kind of place that looked like it had a story, tall, narrow, and built with dark brick that gave it a somber appearance. It was a little run down, but we were drawn to it the moment we saw it. The price was almost too good to be true for a house that size. We didn't question it. We should have. I'm Tom, 32 years old, a mechanical engineer by trade. Laura is an artist, always searching for a place with character, and this house had plenty of it. The realtor had mentioned something about its history, but I barely paid attention. I was just happy we could afford such a big house on our budget. It didn't take long for things to start feeling off. At first, it was small stuff. The old wooden floors creaked constantly, even when no one was walking on them. The house had a draft that made certain rooms feel inexplicably cold, no matter how much we tried to heat them. Laura joked that it was just part of the house's charm. I laughed it off, though I had to admit, the place was eerier at night. A few weeks after we moved in, we decided to explore the attic. Laura wanted to use it as a studio for her painting, and we hadn't gotten around to checking it out. When we pulled down the ladder and climbed up, we found a cluttered, dusty space filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture left behind by the previous owners. Among the debris, there was an old trunk shoved into the corner, its brass locks tarnished with age. It was the kind of thing that sparked curiosity immediately. Laura smiled, eager to open it up, but as I approached it, a strange feeling washed over me, an inexplicable sense of dread, like something was wrong. I hesitated. "Come on, let's see what's inside," Laura urged, already pulling at the latch. The trunk wasn't locked, and it creaked open easily. Inside were old clothes, yellowed with time, and a few scattered documents. At the bottom of the pile, we found a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and worn, but the pages inside were still legible. As Laura thumbed through it, her face fell into a frown. "What is it?" I asked, leaning over her shoulder. "It's strange," she said quietly. "It looks like someone was keeping a record of nightmares." I took the journal from her hands and read a few entries. Each one described vivid, disturbing dreams, visions of a cold hand reaching out from the shadows, grabbing the writer, pulling them into the darkness. The entries became more frantic over time, with the writer claiming that the hand wasn't just in their dreams anymore. It had started appearing when they were awake. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just the ramblings of someone with a vivid imagination. Still, the unease lingered. We put the journal back in the trunk, sealed it up, and tried to forget about it. That night, something changed. It was late, probably around 2 a.m. Laura was sound asleep beside me, but I was restless. The wind howled outside, and the old house creaked and groaned as if settling into itself. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the strange feeling that had been creeping over me ever since we found that journal. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was coming from inside the room. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, and scanned the darkness. The room was still, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon through the window. But I could feel it. Something was wrong. I swung my legs out of bed, standing up slowly. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the rustling sound grew louder. It was coming from the far corner of the room, near the closet. I took a step toward the closet, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But as I approached, I felt something icy cold brush against my arm. I jerked back, heart racing, and stared into the darkness. Nothing, just shadows. I backed away, quickly returning to bed and pulling the covers up to my chin like a scared child. Laura stirred beside me, mumbling something in her sleep, but I didn't wake her. I didn't want to scare her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the room with me. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Stress, maybe. Moving into a new house and all that. But as the days passed, things started getting worse. It started small, things going missing. A set of keys, my phone, a pair of shoes. We'd searched the house from top to bottom, only to find them later in places we hadn't looked. Laura thought it was just the chaos of moving, but I wasn't so sure. Then came the footsteps. They echoed through the house late at night, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing the hallways. I'd get out of bed to check, but the house was always empty. The air felt colder, thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. But the worst part was the hand. I started seeing it out of the corner of my eye, just a glimpse, here and there. A pale, bony hand reaching out from the shadows, disappearing the moment I turned my head. It was like my mind was playing tricks on me, but the more it happened, the more real it felt. One night I woke up to find Laura standing at the foot of the bed, staring at the door. "Laura?" I called out softly. She didn't respond. She just stood there, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face pale as if in a trance. "Laura!" I said louder, rushing out of bed to shake her. She blinked, snapping out of it, and looked at me with confusion. What happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. "You were sleepwalking," I said, trying to keep my own fear at bay. "You were just standing there." She looked at the door, her expression darkening. "I had a nightmare. There was a hand grabbing me." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told her about the hand, not once. Over the next few weeks, things spiraled out of control. Laura's sleepwalking grew worse, and I started waking up with bruises on my arms and legs, as if someone or something had grabbed me in the night. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't explain what was happening. Then came the night it finally got me. It was late again, the house silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I was lying in bed, wide awake, dreading what might happen next. I had started sleeping with the lights on, hoping that would keep whatever was haunting us at bay, but it didn't help. I heard the rustling again, that same eerie sound I'd heard the first night. It was closer this time, right by the side of the bed. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to move, to wake Laura, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, and then I felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, wrapping around my ankle. I gasped, jerking my leg away, but the hand held on tight. I kicked and thrashed, trying to break free, but it only tightened its grip, pulling me toward the edge of the bed. I screamed, finally snapping out of my paralysis, and scrambled out of bed, yanking my leg free. The hand disappeared into the darkness beneath the bed, but I could still feel its icy grip on my skin. Laura woke up terrified, but I couldn't explain what had happened. I didn't have to. The bruises on my ankle told the story. The next morning, we packed our bags and left the house. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing our deposit. I just wanted out. We moved into a small apartment in the city, far away from that cursed place. I tried to forget about what happened, but the memory of that hand still haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up and swear I can feel it again, reaching for me from the darkness. And I wonder if it ever really let go. A few months later, out of morbid curiosity, I did some research on the house. It turns out we weren't the first ones to experience strange things there. Over the years, there had been countless reports of ghostly hands grabbing people, pulling them into the shadows. Some said it was the spirit of a woman who had died there, her body buried in the walls of the house, her restless spirit reaching out for anyone who dared to live in her home. But no one ever found her body, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still feel her icy fingers wrapping around my wrist, reminding me that she's still out there, waiting in the dark. I've always hated graveyards. There's something about them that feels wrong to me. I'm not a superstitious person, but growing up in a small town with stories of haunted places around every corner, you can't help but feel uneasy, especially when you're surrounded by headstones that carry more history than the town itself. But it wasn't until I became the night guard at Rosewood Cemetery that I learned just how real the stories could be. It started like any other ordinary job. I needed the money after losing my last gig, and the offer seemed too good to pass up. Easy hours, quiet nights, and almost no human interaction. The job description was simple. Patrol the grounds, make sure no one was sneaking in, and report any suspicious activity. What they failed to mention was what happened after dark, what really lurked among the gravestones when the sun went down. I remember my first shift vividly. I stood at the iron gates of Rosewood Cemetery, looking out over the rows of tombstones stretching as far as I could see. The wind was cold, and the leaves rustled in an almost ominous way. I tightened my jacket and walked through the gates, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air smelled of damp earth, and the fog rolled in thick, covering the ground like a blanket. Easy money, I muttered to myself, trying to shake the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. The first few hours were uneventful, just as I expected. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and distant hoots of owls. I made my rounds, walking between rows of graves, some dating back to the 1800s, reading names and dates as I passed. Then something strange happened. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard a soft scraping sound behind me. My heart jumped, but when I spun around, nothing was there. Just the grave markers and the thick fog. "It's just your imagination," I whispered, laughing nervously. But then, the sound came again. Louder this time. It was the distinct sound of something dragging across the ground, slow and deliberate. My stomach churned. Flashlight shaking in my hand, I swept the beam in the direction of the noise. Nothing. I started to move again, but the moment I did, the sound followed me. Footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps. My breath hitched, and I turned back quickly, shining the light across the path. The fog parted, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the last row of tombstones. But when I blinked, it was gone. By the second night, I had convinced myself it was just nerves. First night jitters, nothing more. But as I walked through the cemetery again, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. Every time I stopped, the footsteps would stop too, and when I moved, they resumed, keeping a steady distance behind me. I didn't want to admit it, but something was wrong. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving where no shadows should be, and figures standing in places that were empty when I turned to look. I told myself it was just the fog playing tricks, that it was just my mind filling in the gaps. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was that same night when I first saw her. I was nearing the oldest part of the cemetery, where the headstones were weathered and broken, when I saw her standing by a large oak tree, a woman in a long, tattered dress. Her back was to me, and her hair hung limp over her shoulders. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. "Ma'am?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're not supposed to be here." She didn't move. I swallowed hard, inching closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hey, I said you can't be—" The woman slowly turned her head. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, and her eyes were hollow. Empty sockets stared back at me, and a faint, unnatural smile curled on her lips. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. In the blink of an eye, she was gone, vanished into the night like smoke. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to comprehend what I had just seen. My heart thundered in my chest, and my legs felt weak, like they could give out at any moment. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn and run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. A cold, creeping sensation crawled up my spine as I realized something else. The grave next to the oak tree, the one where I had seen her standing, was freshly dug. By the third night, the haunting became undeniable. I hadn't told anyone about the woman. Who would believe me? I barely believed myself. But as the night wore on, things only got worse. The footsteps were louder now, closer. I started hearing whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs that drifted through the air, as if the very graves themselves were talking. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. My flashlight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. I was near the mausoleum when I heard it, a low, guttural moan, like someone in pain. It sent a shiver down my spine. I followed the sound, against every instinct telling me to turn around and leave. My heart raced as I approached the sound, and then I saw him. A man was crouched over one of the graves, his back bent at an unnatural angle. His hands clawed at the dirt, digging furiously into the earth. His clothes were torn and covered in grime, and his hair hung in greasy strands over his face. But it was his skin that made my blood run cold. It was ashen, gray, like he had been dead for days. "Hey!" I shouted, taking a step back. The man's head jerked up, his eyes wide and unblinking. He opened his mouth, and the moaning grew louder, more guttural, as if it were coming from somewhere deep within him. Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My feet pounded against the gravel path, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted toward the gate. But the footsteps, those heavy, dragging footsteps, followed close behind. I could hear the man's moans growing louder, more desperate, as he chased after me. I burst through the iron gates and slammed them shut, my hands trembling. I collapsed on the other side, panting, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. When I finally looked up, the cemetery was still, silent, as if nothing had happened. I didn't want to go back, but I had to. The job wasn't just a job anymore. It was a curse. The last night was the worst. As soon as I stepped through the gates, I knew I wasn't alone. The fog was thick, swirling around my feet like it had a mind of its own. The footsteps were there, louder and closer than ever, but this time I didn't run. I made my way to the old oak tree where I had first seen the woman. The air was heavy, suffocating, and then I saw them. Not just the woman, but dozens of them, figures standing among the graves, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The dead were walking. I stood frozen as they began to move, their bodies slow and deliberate, like they were being pulled by invisible strings. Their mouths hung open, but no sound came out. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. They closed in around me, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes vacant. And then from behind me, I heard the voice. "It's your turn now." The cold hand gripped my shoulder, and everything went dark. I woke up outside the gates of Rosewood Cemetery, the dawn breaking on the horizon. But something was different. My body felt wrong, heavy, cold, and when I looked down, I realized why. My name was carved into the nearest headstone,